continue with introductions. Jim?
Thank you, Eric. Thanks for all of you for tuning in today. Our guest speaker today is Pauline Frommer from the illustrious Frommer family. I knew her father, Arthur, many years ago when I worked with KLM, and we'd meet from time to time. And his books, $5, $10, $15 a day, were a travel Bible for most of us. I heard Pauline speak on a Skull New York webinar a couple of months ago, and I think before it was over, I actually asked her if she would do something for Skull USA, and she immediately said yes, so I'm very happy with that. I also want to talk about a couple of things that are coming up. Tomorrow at 3 o'clock, we're having the first of our new member webinars, which will be hosted by our favorite interviewer, Morgan Maravich, who I will turn it over to in a few seconds. We have about 65 new members this year in Skull USA, and we have several that joined from September to December last year. So it should be a nice turnout. And we're just going to tell you about Skull in general, the fact that we're a global as well as a local organization, and try to get you to realize that you have a whole family of colleagues around the world. Next Thursday on the 20th, we will have the third of our presidents webinars, and we're trying to get regional presidents together so they will know what's going on in either club, help each other, give good ideas to each other so we can network better. With that said, I want to turn it over to Morgan Maravich.
Thank you, Jim, and welcome everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar with Pauline Frommer. We are delighted to have you all with us today, and it is my honor to be able to introduce Pauline. Pauline is the co-president of Frommer Media, the publisher of the Frommer guidebooks and Frommers.com with her father, founder Arthur Frommer. The Frommer guidebooks have sold 75 million books since their founding in 1957. Pauline is an award-winning author of several guidebooks, including the best-selling Frommer's Easy Guide to New York City and countless articles. She was host for many years of the nationally syndicated radio show, The Frommer Travel Show, and penned an internationally syndicated newspaper column. You may recognize her face as she has talked on several travel shows, including about travel on several shows, including The Today Show, Good Morning America, NBC Evening News, Live with Kelly, and many more, and every local newscast you can even name. She's a proud mom to two very well-traveled daughters and is married to a Columbia University professor. So Pauline, welcome.
Hi, nice to be here with you all.
We're delighted to have you. So thank you again for joining us today. So I'd love just to kick it off to talk about you, the company, Frommer Media, just get some history and some background on the story.
Right. Well, as you said, I run the company with my 91-year-old dad, who was the founder, Arthur Frommer. He kind of founded it by accident. He was, the day after he graduated from Yale Law School, he was drafted into the Army because the Korean War was raging. And he was the only one in his law school class. He was one of the few to get drafted because he was one of the few who didn't have connections. So he got drafted. But luckily, because he was the child of immigrants, he grew up learning Russian and German. And he actually also studied those languages later on. And when the Army figured that out, instead of sending him to Korea, they sent him to Europe. And he loved Europe. He started traveling all around on the Army jets. And this was right after World War II, so things were still in rubble in many places. And his fellow GIs would never leave the base. And so he would come back and they would pepper him with questions. How did you do it? It was safe? You could do it with so little money? And he thought, well, maybe I should write a little book. So he self-published a little book called The GI's Guide to Europe. And the day it was published, it sold out at the PXs across Europe. So he went back to New York, practiced law for about a year, and then thought, well, maybe maybe civilians would like this. So he took some time off, went back to Europe, and wrote a book called Europe on $5 a Day, which became the best-selling guidebook of all time, and launched the Frommer guidebooks. And for about a decade, he did both, but then the books became too big, and he decided to dedicate himself to that. He still misses law, believe it or not. And so when I came along, I would go to Europe with him and my mother, who ended up writing part of the book too. I started traveling to Europe with them when I was 4 months old. This was before there were cribs, so they would just push me into a drawer for the night. And my father said that whenever they would dare take me to a really expensive restaurant, that's when I would throw a tantrum. So my father has worked in the books since 1957, since they were founded. We got ownership back about 5 years ago, and I've been the editorial director since then. It's been a challenging time with COVID. Going into COVID, we had 103 active titles, but when COVID hit, I canceled all the books that were about to be printed because I knew they wouldn't be worth the paper they were printed on, because the world has changed so drastically. And so I've put all the books on delay. We've now started researching the domestic guides, the US guides. We're still holding off on the international guides, but some of the US ones we are starting to research, and it's going to be an interesting task. But we also have Frommers.com, where before the pandemic we were getting about 5 million unique users per month. It's been less. It's actually getting back to our old numbers recently. And we've spent all our time covering the breaking travel news. And there's actually been fascinating and really odd and interesting developments to cover. And so I kind of pivoted away from the books in the last year. Now I'm pivoting back. But the books are where my heart is. Ever since my father stopped writing, we started hiring amazing experts all around the globe because we felt we would get better information from people who were embedded in the places they were covering. This is different than other guidebooks. Actually, Lonely Planet has what I call parachute artists mostly. They have a team of writers and they send them to Hungary 1 year, Brazil the next, and expect them to find things. We use local journalists, and we're very, very proud to use local journalists because that's a profession that's been decimated in the last decade. And so we're keeping a lot of really, really talented, smart, ethical people working.
Wow, that's amazing. So I know we had chatted about the redesign of the books, and you had just mentioned about starting with the domestic ones. How do you even go about doing a redesign in a pandemic? And I guess where did you even start with getting them into the domestic? Were there certain destinations you've decided domestically to start with? Like what was the strategy going into that redesign?
Well, we looked at what was selling, and we also looked at which destinations were getting the most hits on Frommers.com. So selling has been Arizona, New England, basically the places where you can get out into nature. Right now, city guides are in the dumps, with the exception of New Orleans, actually. A lot of people are searching our site for New Orleans. So I have a feeling that will come back first because, you look at New York, which I actually write the New York City Guide. It's one of the highlights of my year when I get to do the nightlife for a month and pretend I'm still young. I'm always the oldest person in these places. My teenagers giggle at me because I come home, they come home and I'm taking a disco nap because I'm going to be out from 11 to 5 in the morning, covering nightlife. But without Broadway back, it's been rough for New York. I think that industry is such a draw for the city and has so many corollary industries. Washington, D.C., without the Smithsonian, I think it's been harder for them to get visitors back. Whereas people still want to whoop it up in New Orleans. So I think that's coming back sooner. But I think once those things are back, we will bring back Washington, D.C. and New York too.
That's great to hear. So anyone that's tuning in today, if you have a question, we're going to touch on a variety of different topics in our conversation with Pauline. So as we go through the different topics, if you have any questions to ask, please feel free to just pop them in the question box, and we'll get those out to Pauline. So to kind of kick us off, we're going to talk about a very popular, and it's in the news, I feel like every day, the cruise industry. So where do you see the cruise industry going? How can the industry help? We've seen the articles about the CDC, the guidance. What can you tell us?
I think that the cruise industry has two major challenges. The first is PR. 6 months ago, every single article you read on cruising had the phrase floating Petri dish in it. People just, you had these terrible visuals of people being stuck on ships, not being able to get off, getting off very ill, being stuck in their cabins. It just was a disaster PR-wise for the cruise industry, and I think it will turn off a certain segment of the population who don't want to be that person stuck in the cabin. You've got that challenge, and you've got a challenge with ports. A lot of ports are very, very nervous about a floating vessel coming to them and offloading infected people. And I think that's why there's one big solution to both these issues, although the port one has another corollary issue to it that I'll discuss in a moment. But the big solution is vaccines. The cruise ships pretty much have to say we are only carrying vaccinated passengers, and our crews are vaccinated. I think they have to do that to restore trust, and they have to do that to go back to the destinations they want to. Interestingly, they're all coming back in different ways. Norwegian Cruise Lines has announced they will only take vaccinated people. That means no children, because children can't be vaccinated. So for the near future, Norwegian is going to be adults only. And what has that meant? They haven't announced this, but if you look at their itineraries, they have much more interesting itineraries than the competition. I think more people are letting those boats in. The competition, those who are allowing unvaccinated children on board, are having to stay in smaller areas. Some are only going to, say, the Bahamas. Others are really only going to Bermuda. So it's going to be interesting, especially because of the, I don't want to get political, but the governor of both Texas and Florida, which are two of the biggest states in terms of cruise ports, their probably illegal declaration that vaccine passports will not be allowed in their states. And I say illegal because these things were just announced by the governors. They never went through the legislature. So a lot of legal experts are saying, this is just hot air. There's really probably no enforcement, but who knows? Who knows? These two states have Republican legislatures, so they may just follow the governor. But this could make things really, really tricky for the cruise industry. I could see a scenario whereby there are two classes of passengers on board the ship, since the ship can't check for vaccines, those who can go off at the port and those who can't. The other big thing that's happening in the cruise industry is a lot of destinations that used to get a lot of cruise passengers have said, you know what, we've preferred this year without them. And so a lot of destinations are pulling out. Key West in the last election voted to not allow cruise ships anymore. Now, the people in Florida's legislature and the governor get a lot of money from the cruise industry. So they're pushing back, and they're saying that even though Key West voted for this, this may not happen. So who knows? But Venice just got rid of big cruise ships. The Cayman Islands, which was the third largest cruise port in all of the Caribbean, is getting rid of them. And so I think we're going to be seeing very, very different types of cruise itineraries. Sadly for passengers, I think maybe more of a reliance on private islands, which, you know, is a very good way for the cruise line to help their bottom line, because everything that's spent is theirs in those cases. But I think it diminishes the appeal of cruising. Although, you know what, I may be wrong. A lot of people love the private islands. I find them dull, but.
It'll be interesting to see how it all returns, and to your point, how each one is returning differently and in different ways. So again, that makes the return to travel a little bit trickier, just because each one is so different. It's almost like when you go into an airport, your airport experience is different based on what's open. So everything is kind of tricky.
Well, one more thing to add to that. I mean, you have, I think it was Royal Caribbean debuting its newest ship in Israel and going through a part of the Mediterranean that a lot of people think is too dangerous because there are pirate issues in that area. So that's a fascinating development. I guess they feel that the threat of pirates is less than the threat of COVID. And they know that Israel has a very good vaccination program, and that, you know, they will be able to get mostly vaccinated people there.
Yeah, I mean, Israel is, I think, still leading among countries for vaccination. So, I mean, that type of logic, to your point, really shows where the threat level to different areas are. You mentioned health, you mentioned the vaccine passport. So I just want to go back and kind of touch on that a little bit. So New York already has a vaccine passport, Excelsior, as which you and I've chatted about, in place. While some, as you mentioned, Florida and Texas are against it. So how do you see this shaping up, or what have you been hearing that how it is coming along? What do you see as a solution to get travel moving? Because some are seeing this as a solution. And how do you see this internationally on the international stage?
I think it's going to be a bumpy road with vaccine passports. The Biden administration has said that they don't think there should be a federal one, which kind of breaks my heart, I got to say, because I think if they could take the lead with this, it would be a lot less chaotic of a rollout, at least here in the United States. But right now, it's both private enterprise and states like New York who are trying to make this work. You're going to have agreement between all of the different partners in this process. So you're going to have to get the airlines on board. You're going to have to get state governments on board. You're going to have to get the federal governments on board, the international governments, that they're all going to have to come up with what these passports say. I'm wondering if there's some kind of marketing fix to this, because the truth is we've had vaccine passports for years. They were called the yellow card, and people use them to get into many places in Africa. If there was just a way to depoliticize this and show that it's common sense, I don't know. I think it's going to be very, very chaotic. And it could lead to long lines at the airports and a lot more hassle for travelers in the short run. Hopefully it'll all shake out, but I don't see how it will right now.
Yeah, it definitely is. I mean, even to the point of New York having one, Texas and Florida not wanting them. I mean, even that is a bit chaotic. And to your point is, I remember going to Kenya and having the yellow card, and they had a very fluid process, and in the rest. So it's almost like there, to your point is, there is a process, but how can we put that together with where we are today? So it'll be interesting to see how it does shake out. We've had some questions come in. Leo Locke says he remembers your dad, and he said we need a global uniform. He says we need a global uniform system in place, otherwise this will be bedlam. Perhaps, and maybe add it to the global entry TSA profiles. So it's a great idea.
I don't know who would do it though. I mean, the World Health Organization has actually come out against global passports. I think partially because a lot of people are talking about these vaccine passports as being digital. Mm-hmm. And some people are saying that would really hurt the people who don't have smartphones. And you don't want to make this something just for the elites of the world. So it should be international, but who would it be? Who would it be?
He says an OSI entry in the PNR. A lot of acronyms for me. Leo, maybe let me tell me what the acronyms are. He's talking shop. Leo, can you tell us what the acronyms are? He's gonna tell us what the acronyms are. I was like, but I'll also go into James Enright from Skull, Washington asks about cancellation policies. And if you have any insight, because we're going back to the cruise conversation, do you see any flexibility about the cancellation policies going forward, and any change with helping the industry going forward with maybe a change in those cancellation policies with how they were during COVID, or will that be something that as we come out of the pandemic where it would go back to how it was?
Well, it's hard to know what the cruise lines will do because they haven't been going, so we haven't really been able to see their cancellation policies in action. But we can look at what the airlines have done. The airlines have done something very interesting. They have made all but the most basic class of tickets. They've brought it back to the 1990s in terms of cancellation policies, meaning if you don't have a basic economy ticket, if you're on any other ticket, you will be able to cancel and rebook without a huge fee, which I think is an amazingly passenger-friendly, or I should say consumer-friendly thing to do, and something they had to do, I think, because in the last year, we've really become very used to, once again, being able to cancel. And with would-be travelers fighting this sense of insecurity and this worry about things changing on a dime, as we all saw they could a year ago, I think the only way they could get passengers back in those seats was to liberalize cancellation policies. And even the worst actors are doing it. Just today, Air Canada, which has a terrible reputation, just today they have announced they're finally going to be giving people their money back. United and Air Canada were really the villains. I hope there's not anybody on from United or Air Canada, but in the last year, whoa, did they anger a lot of consumers to the point where I think a good percentage of the people they angered may never fly them again if they can avoid them. You can't always avoid them. But I would think that if you are a smart travel executive, you're going to have very liberal cancellation policies for the next 2 years, because without them, it's going to be hard to attract customers. So I'm assuming that's what the cruise lines will be doing, but I don't know yet.
Yeah, I'm hoping that with what happened with Air Canada, with the monies that they received from the Canadian government, that you'll see it trickle down to, say, like the Porter, the WestJet, some of the rest of the Canadian airlines too, because right now it's only Air Canada. Right. So I'm hoping that it will also fall to those other airlines as well, which I'm glad to even see it even happen for Air Canada. So that was some progress for our Canadian friends.
Yeah, that was kind of a miracle today. I couldn't believe the headline when I read it.
It was. So keeping with some of the conversation when we started chatting about the airlines, what do you see for the airfare pricing and the way the fees are being done?
Well, while nobody was watching, back in April, American Airlines raised baggage fees. So I think, you got to look at their history. When they can give a fee, they will give a fee. They were making such a huge percentage of their profit from fees. I think it'll have to be the fees that don't terrify passengers, like change fees. So I'm sure we'll see more fees coming back. What was the other part of the question?
Just how do you see the way the fees will be done or being done? Yeah.
And pricing. Well, Hopper is a really, really good source. They've been releasing a lot of really useful information. And they showed that in the week after President Biden made his speech saying that we'll all get to maybe travel to see our families on July 4th. The week after he made that speech, prices and bookings went up 5% within the United States. I think that there's, please, thank God, please, that there's now this desire to travel again, and people are actually acting on it. That seems to be the case. This pent-up demand is finally being unleashed. And so we're going to be seeing airfares ticking up, and Hopper has said that last-minute airfares are really hitting the roof right now. That they're going back to the old ways in terms of really, really charging a lot more for booking tickets within 2 weeks of travel. That has kind of disappeared during the pandemic, and that's back.
Yeah, I think the word I heard was it's gone from nothing to a deluge for the summer. That's been the term that it's been here. And then when you're talking about the flight prices, I booked a flight just for last week within 2 days of each other. It was like 2 days in advance, and I was expecting maybe $100. It was from DC to Atlanta, quick trip. I was expecting maybe $100, $200, over $500. So.
Wow.
Like to the insights that you're saying, it absolutely has already started to happen. And to that point as well, Mike Kaplan from our Skull Club out in San Francisco asks, do you foresee airline and hotel prices climbing dramatically as travel restarts? So that is something that we are starting to, I guess, quasi see a little bit.
I think airline prices are going to climb dramatically. It may be more difficult for hotels, although it really depends on where the hotel is. If the hotel is in a place that is very business centric, I don't think we're going to see a dramatic increase in pricing, because I don't think business travel is going to come back for a while. But we may see rises in more rural destinations or more vacation destinations. Interestingly, during the course of the pandemic, because so many people were nervous about being in enclosed public spaces, hotels really lost their edge versus rentals, versus VRBO, versus Airbnb. There was a major study done that showed that prices for vacation rentals on average in the United States were now higher than for hotels for the very first time. It used to be that you had to be a certain type of traveler to do a rental. You had to be a little bit more confident, because you weren't going to necessarily be able to read as many reviews, or you wouldn't have stayed. You know that if you stayed at a Marriott in Phoenix, it'll be somewhat like the Marriott in Tucson. So I think things have shifted. I think people have really discovered the perks of vacation rentals, the extra room, the access to a kitchen. And I think it's going to be harder for the hotel industry to regain that market share. I think a lot of people who discovered Airbnb during the pandemic may stick with it.
That's very good insight, and you definitely saw a lot of that during the pandemic. Catherine Chalette asks, something very similar to that, where we're hearing that the travel leisure is expected to come back quite strongly, which to your point about Airbnb and all that, it did. There was that travel, and there still is. And you had mentioned about business travel being one of the last to come back. And she mentions, however, business travel is expected to stay at lower levels for the coming years. Do you have any views on this?
I think she's absolutely right. That's another thing that we all learned during the last year, that Zoom meetings can be effective. And so just as landlords are pulling their hair out because they may not be getting back a lot of their office clientele, I think convention hotels and business hotels are facing a difficult road. It's going to be interesting to see. And that also is one of the reasons we're seeing perhaps such a sharp increase in airfares. I mean, it used to be that business travelers, they only take up 20% of the room on a plane, but they make up usually 80% of the income for the airline for each flight. And so without them subsidizing the rest of us, prices are going to kick up.
That's very true. It's a very good point. To the conversation about hotels, we know a lot of things in this process, and you mentioned this about the Zoom meetings, is a lot of things have become more digital and high tech. How do you see travelers adapting this more? Do you see this continuing post-pandemic? For example, the hotels, you can now check into the hotel all on your phone. How do you see this going forward?
I think this is another thing that people have gotten used to. Actually, in December of 2019, I did a major trends article for Frommers.com, and I talked a lot about how last-minute discounts for pretty much everything were disappearing, and instead it was all becoming advanced discounts, because the many industries, ski resorts, attractions like theme parks, had decided to purposefully push the public towards advanced reservations, because it was so much better for them when that happened, because they would know how many hot dogs they needed to buy for the theme park and how much staff to have at the restaurant, and they would be able to plan if they could get the public trained to do advanced planning. The public is now trained because of social distancing. We've had to advance plan everything, and we've had to do it on our devices. And so everything is moving onto those devices. Interestingly, even some entities that had tried to introduce their own tech, like Disney World with the Magic Bands, which you would have to pay on, they're phasing those out. They want you to be on your phone. They've realized with the cost of the upkeep of these Magic Bands, why not just put people on their phones? That actually makes more sense. We may be seeing that on board cruise ships too. So yes, everything is on your phone, and there have been dozens of new types of organizations right before the pandemic who popped up to better sell you travel items on your phone. Companies you could opt in on so that you'd be walking down the street and it would ping you and say, oh, this museum is nearby. Would you like to pay for entry right now? And so you would pay for entry and be able to get into the museum. So everything is moving to our phones, for good and for bad. It worries me because I think this will lock out a lot of the smaller players. That, you know, just keeping up with this technology is so costly. It could make travel less of a mom and pop type activity. And it also, you know, if you're always staring at your phone, you're not in the place, you're in your phone. So this is I think it's a definite trend. It's one that worries me, and that one that I hope there's going to be a lot of pushback against.
Yeah, I definitely. You hit the saying right on the head. Is travel is about being in that moment and experiencing that place. And so if it's good because you can do everything all on your phone and it's right there at your fingertips. But also at the same time, it's almost that balance where we're gonna have to learn to put our phones away and actually experience it and continue to enjoy it while we're there. So I think you really hit that one on the head. So James says, from Skull Washington again, says, artificial intelligence AI uses data to predict things based on past behaviors. Will destinations suggest appropriate choices and provide other personalized recommendations and use virtual assistant using Alexa and Siri to provide itinerary updates?
I think that's already happening. Yes, absolutely. As AI culls through more and more data, we have more and more insight into travelers. Now, some of this is being pushed back against. It's one of the reasons you have to opt in for cookies when you're online. And those rules may get even stricter thanks to the EU. The EU has gotten much more upset about privacy than we have. But if the EU changes a lot of these privacy rules in terms of how much data travel companies can collect and destinations can collect about people, the entire travel industry may have to jump to their standards, just because it would be hard to have technology that was so different for that major region and for other regions. So I think this is a major trend now, but we may be losing some of the access to that data. And as a book publisher, I hope we are, because there's something insidious about it. I like people making their own decisions after having read and learned, and it just feels a little too brainwashy to me. This type of AI controlled, here's what you should do. Oh, how did they know? Oh, it says I know everything. I don't know. I think it's just to keep people on the same path. Sorry.
Yeah, it's also kind of freaky because when I look at my phone and I get ads for things that I was maybe talking about or maybe just walked past, and I'm like, oh my goodness, my phone knows way too much about my life.
Yeah. But that makes it on Frommers.com. We have an instantaneous auction for every ad space that isn't sold. And I should say, Frommers.com, none of our articles are ads. We don't do native advertising, but we have ads next to them. And you come to our site, and if they know that you're in the market for a used car, suddenly you're going to get used car things, because we have this auction going. But we are learning we are going to have to shift the auction dramatically because of the EU's privacy rules. So it's going to be changing.
Absolutely, I understand. So with the question being around travel planning, what tips, tricks do you have for anyone that's looking to plan travel? What's the easiest way to plan a trip coming out of the pandemic?
Wow. Well, I guess that really depends on what type of traveler you are. Right now, there's some weird trends that are really going to shape people's budgets. So, for example, this may sound crazy, but the very first thing you have to do when considering travel anywhere where you'll need a rental car is see how much that rental car will cost. There is a huge crisis in the rental car industry here in the United States. Is this too obvious? Do you know about this, or should I?
I do. I personally experienced it when I was in Florida.
Yeah.
I had a reservation, and there was a family that did not, and there were no cars to be had for them. So I've seen it live.
Yes. So basically, at the height of the pandemic, all of the major car rental agencies culled their fleets by selling cars to make themselves more liquid, and now they can't get cars because there's a shortage. There's a manufacturing glitch. There aren't enough semiconductors to make cars, and so we are seeing cars in certain areas of the country being rented for $300, $400, $500 a day when you can get a car. So right now, for any type of travel that is going to involve a car, that's the first thing you have to check, because this is a crisis that isn't going to get better anytime soon, because there just aren't enough cars for the car rental agencies to buy, and there aren't enough people doing car sharing. So that's a tip. Gosh, what else in terms of I mean, a lot of people are going to be going to outdoors destinations. So you really want to research which ones are going to be less crowded this year, because for the first time, well, not for the first time ever, Yellowstone and Yosemite and Great Smoky Mountains have always been overcrowded, or have been for the last decade. But other places, you're going to have crowds on the trails, and it won't be as pleasant an experience. As well, because in certain areas, attractions aren't fully open. A lot of families are picking hotels with the hope of hanging out at the pool, but the pools are now getting so overcrowded in many places that they're not comfortable, and they've actually had to cut off how many people they're actually putting in. I've heard from somebody who went to Palm Springs, and then from somebody else who went to Florida, having to put in guards to tell people, sorry, you have to come back to the pool later. So if that's important to you, in an area where there aren't other attractions, you may want to go to a smaller, more boutique-y hotel where there won't be as much competition for lounge chairs.
Wow, interesting. Yeah, it's I'll say that traveling during COVID, and when the hotels have had the restriction, it was quite nice. It was nice, but not nice, just because of COVID. But with the hotels having the limited restrictions and occupancy, being able to have the limited amount of people around, to your point, around the pools and say out at the beach, it provided you with a lot more room, and you weren't, for example, rushed to get a lounge chair, rushed to go to lunch and do a lot of things. So it provided a little bit more of a relaxed atmosphere, which I much appreciated. So that was actually the nice part about it. To the point about traveling, there was but there was a lot of other sides to it, but that part was actually nice because it gave you a different perspective with there not being as many people.
Yeah, there also were some unusual opportunities that arose. For example, the company that used to take rock stars on tour in these tour buses, these kitted out, high-end tour buses, they had nobody to tour around with. And so they started creating private tours just for people who wanted to feel like a rock star. And these buses have beds in them. And so you would get on a bus, you'd have a driver, you'd drive overnight to somewhere in the United States that you wanted to see. While you were sleeping, the driver was driving, you wake up in a new place, and you had this kind of land cruise. And you've also seen that with a lot of the tour companies. A lot of the tour companies have pivoted to offering private tours for small groups. They're saying, yeah, sure, come, we'll do our standard tour for your family of 10, you and your cousins, or whatever it is. So there's been some very interesting opportunities that won't come back again soon. I don't think you're going to, once touring bus, once rock concerts are back, you're not going to be able to travel like a rock star again. That was pretty cool, actually.
That sounds amazing.
Yeah.
So a question that I think is on everyone's mind, and a lot of people are wondering, domestic versus international. We know domestic has already started to come back, and we've talked a little bit about that. But how do you see the return shaping up, and particularly on the international side? So when do you see, and we know that there's been some stats and figures out there about when international return will start, and like hopefully when some countries will start to open. But how do you see it returning? Like what thoughts do you have there?
It's going to be region by region, and a lot has to do with the uneven rollout of the vaccine internationally. Because places like India and Brazil are barely getting the vaccine and are seeing this flowering of new variants. I worry that those could be no-go zones for a couple of years. We'll see. As well, we're seeing these horrifying surges in Europe, which could keep people from going to many places. I mean, you go to France right now, there's you can't from the U.S. And there's a curfew. I mean, they're in lockdown right now. On the brighter side of the equation, you can go to Mexico very easily. You can go to the Caribbean very easily right now, to most islands. So I think it's going to be a very spotty place by place thing. It'll be interesting to see if more countries start doing what Australia and New Zealand are doing by creating travel corridors between them. And sometimes it's not even the country, it's the region within the country. Phuket will be opening up to visitors far before the rest of Thailand will. Now, do you go all the way to Thailand from the US? I mean, if you're in the region, it's different, but do you go all the way there from here if you can only go to Phuket? I don't know. I don't know. I also think that I spoke to somebody who was talking about how it's kind of like when you're in the market for a mate and you start dating, and when you first start dating someone, just holding their hand is so incredibly exciting. You don't have to do anything else for a while because that's so exciting. I think it's going to be that way with travel. I think that people are going to be taking trips closer to home and still getting that charge that they used to get from an African safari or from a trip to the vineyards of France. I think for the near future, I think there's going to be slower travel with people staying in one place more. And I think that it's going to be closer to home for the vast majority, at least of American travelers. Part of that also has to do with the fact that if you get COVID abroad, you will have to quarantine. And I think that is a real wet blanket in terms of, is that the right phrase? Well, anyway, in terms of international travel, people are terrified of that, of getting stuck somewhere.
Yeah, to what you said, when I took my first trip coming out of COVID, and I got in the Uber and I got to the airport, it was you had that excitement because you hadn't done it in so long, and then to arrive in the destination and just that whole experience of which you used to always do or used to do however many months or how many times a year. It brought back all of those memories, and you kind of I almost just kind of wanted to sit in the airport and just hang out for a few minutes and just take it all in again because you hadn't really been there in a while. But to that point is I want to say I didn't care where I was going. It was just the fact that I was going somewhere and I was having that whole travel experience again. So you really kind of you hit it there where you're going to have that experience no matter how far you're going. It's just that travel. But you mentioned about getting stuck internationally. The COVID insurance that's being offered about when you're traveling. What are your thoughts about having that, the utilization of that? Is there anything there that you have?
Well, we've seen a couple of resort chains say to travelers, we will give you tests on site. If you get stuck here, we will pay for your quarantine here. That's happened with a handful of destinations and a handful of resort chains. I think it's the best marketing ever. I think it's incredibly smart. And I think it's one of the reasons Mexico has come roaring back pretty solidly, because a lot of places in Mexico are doing that. We're not seeing that more generally. And travel insurance can be tricky in the pandemic. Travel interruption should cover you if you have to quarantine somewhere. So most policies, from what I understand, will work. But say you wanted to to cancel because there was a surge in the destination. Fear of travel usually isn't covered. And so a lot of people are going for cancel for any reason insurance policies when the destination or the resort doesn't have built-in insurance. But I think the built-in insurance for travel providers to give and for destinations to give is money well spent. I think you get the word out about that, you will get visitors.
Absolutely, and the campaigns that, for the ones that that you're referencing, I know that there have been many of agents that have said it is phenomenal. They've done it. Some of them even give like balcony rooms if you're stuck. So it's a phenomenal program. So any last thoughts to leave with us, Pauline?
Please visit us at frommers.com. Please support your local bookstores. It's been a really rough go for bookstores, and many of the great ones are closing, and these are real cultural and neighborhood centers. I don't say it just because they're our partners. It's because I'm a bibliophile and I love bookstores. So that has nothing to do with travel, but just please support bookstores, especially the independents.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing your insights. They were fantastic.
Sure.
And thank you to everyone who joined in today. We truly appreciate you joining in and hearing Pauline's insights and hearing more about Frommer Media and the books that their team is redesigning coming out of COVID. What a task at hand. So just so that anyone that's tuning in is aware, we will have our next webinar with Richard Bangs on May 12th at 2 p.m. So please feel free to sign up and tune in for that. And at this time, I will turn it back over to Jim Dwyer for any final announcements.
Thank you, Morgan. And thanks to Pauline Frommer for an enlightening, engaging series of questions and answers. I was going to say webinar, but it was great to hear off the cuff comments from Pauline. As Morgan said, we have Richard Bangs coming up shortly in our next webinar. Reminder again, tomorrow, Thursday, we have the first of our new member webinars at 3 p.m. And next Thursday, August 20th, we have the next President's webinar. So hopefully you can tune in. I hope you enjoy these monthly, sometimes twice monthly webinars that we're doing. We're trying to educate and enlighten all of you and keep you engaged. So thank you very much, and see you soon. Thank you.